Welcome to another edition of In Conversation with me, Doug Harris, and today I'm in conversation with John Mosey. John, thank you very much for joining us.
Nice to be here, Doug.
And of course, in many ways, as we will explain as we go on, although we're talking to you, we're also going to be talking about your daughter Helga.
That's right, yeah.
Just before, obviously, we reveal to everybody what that means, but just before we get on to that, tell us a little bit of what life was like growing up in that family together, being happy together.
Yeah, our family wasn't a Christian family. My parents came to know Christ later on in life after me. But I grew up in the city of Coventry while the German bombs were falling on the city, flattening the city centre, and particularly the cathedral, just left with the walls standing and the spire. And I went to school there, and at the age of 13, listening to Billy Graham. He was in Haringey, I was in the Central Hall in Coventry. First time it was relayed around the country, and that night I gave my life to Christ. Interestingly enough, actually, that was Thursday night. By Sunday I'd read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts and a bit of Romans, and the church that I was sort of starting to go to had an open air every Sunday night in the precinct of Coventry. And that night, the leader thrust the microphone into my hand and said, "There's a young man here, got something to tell you." I was 13, you know, and I gave my first testimony that night, and I knew God had called me to be a preacher. But I grew up there, and I went to school and eventually went into the aircraft industry as a technical illustrator. And then I left that and set up in a business with another fellow. But in the meantime, while I was studying, I used to eat my sandwiches in the old cathedral, if it was a nice day. And I'd sit there amongst the ruins, and on the wall there was this charred cross of the old two of the beams from the roof. They'd put them in the form of a cross, and underneath the words, "Father, forgive." And I had little idea at that point that there was going to come a time in my life when I was going to have to give some very serious thought to this matter of forgiveness, what it is and perhaps what it isn't as well.
And tell us, what are your memories of Helga growing up?
Yeah, I married a German lady. I learned the truth of that verse, "Love your enemies," I guess. and we had our firstborn was Helga, a bubbly, bright kid, and then we had a boy called Marcus, who is now the pastor of our church where we are. But Helga was a bubbly kid. She got a good place to study at King Edward VI Grammar School in Birmingham, and she was really, her great love was music. She loved the Lord Jesus. She played the piano and led the worship in our church. We had, I think, a 15-piece orchestra at one point with bassoons and oboes and clarinets. But she sang with the Birmingham Bach Choir, the National Youth Choir, which is a pick of all the kids around the country. And she wanted to sing professionally. She played the violin, played the piano, was in demand in recorder consorts. But she wanted to sing. She had a lovely, still developing mezzo-soprano voice. Yeah.
I think we should reveal a little more at this time, because it was in December, some 24 years ago, that she was actually on Pan Am Flight 103. And as most people will remember, that was the flight that came out of the skies onto Lockerbie.
Yeah.
That, of course, is the relevance of Father Forgive that you were saying earlier on.
Yeah.
Just before we get on to that, tell us a little bit about what you remember of those last days with Helga.
Helga, she'd gone to the States. She got a place to study music at Lancaster University, but she had taken a year out, gap year, with our encouragement, gone to the States working as a nanny, been there a few months, came back for a week before Christmas to collect her school music prize, meet all her old friends who'd gone up to universities. And then I took her back from Birmingham, where we lived, or Oldbury, near Birmingham, down to Heathrow. For a week I'd been the chauffeur. "Dad, can you pick me up here? Dad, can you take me there?" You know, and it was lovely. We'd had our teenage days, you know. She wasn't a perfect daughter, then I wasn't a perfect father. And, you know, "Dad, I hate you." Sort of, we've got that all behind us, and we'd had a lovely week. I took her down to Heathrow, to put her on the plane, checked her bags in, and we sat and chatted, and then I drove back to Birmingham. Yeah.
And do you remember how you heard the news of what was happening?
Yeah, I remember it very clearly. It's etched on my brain. It's the pivot of our whole lives. Everything is either before or after Lockerbie, you know. And I'd got back from London, from Heathrow. I had a bit of supper, was putting some books on my new bookshelves, and phone rang, and it was a widow lady, Auntie Winnie, from the church, who'd had 8 sons, 8 boys, no girls, and Helga was the daughter she loved. She thought the world of our Helga. And she said, "Oh, Pastor, did Helga get away all right?" And I said, "Well, yes, thank you, Winnie. Why?" Well, she said, "There's been a plane crash in Scotland." Now, I'd travelled very widely throughout Asia, and a missions director from Afghanistan through to the Pacific. But I'd never been to the States at that time. And to me, you know, Scotland was up there and America was over there. And I didn't realise that's the way they go sometimes. So I said, "Oh, thanks, Winnie." And I turned the television on. I remember it was about 5 to 9, and there was a news flash. I called my wife and our son Marcus, he was 15 then, and he was sitting on the sofa, and Lisa, my wife, was sitting on the arm of the sofa, and I was standing next to her. And we stood watching pictures of Lockerbie in flames, ambulances, but nobody to help, you know. And I can remember thinking how awful, these poor people, how dreadful, you know.
So you had no idea at
no,
first?
that's the thing, Doug. These things don't happen to us, do they?
Right.
Especially when we've asked God for a safe journey for our girl. You know, we're observers of other people's disasters until it happens to us. And of course, you know, I'm sure, you know, out there are so many individual and personal disasters that never hit the headlines. Ours just happens to have been very highly political and controversial, but they're just as real. But I remember thinking that, never dreaming it was anything to do with us. And then it came up on the screen, Pan Am Flight 103, still didn't register with me. No. I checked her bags in, but my wife said, "That's Helga's plane." You know, I think mothers have an extra sense when it comes to these things. There was, you can imagine, there was a silence, which seemed to go on forever, but I suppose was for a few seconds. Silence was broken by Marcus sitting there shouting at the television screen, "No, no, no, no!" And then my wife, with the words barely able to crawl out of her mouth, really, "Helga, Helga, Helga." And I couldn't find any words, very unusual for me, but I was sort of struck dumb. And we watched, and then I remember it went on to the sport. And I remember there was something about how much was being spent on credit cards at Christmas. So we switched it off, and we stood together in our room and in our lounge, put our arms around each other and asked God to help us.
And I mean, by the next morning, TV crews were after you, and a whole number of interviews. And one of the questions they were all inevitably going to ask you is, how do you feel about the perpetrators?
Yeah.
What were your answers? How did you feel by this next morning when it was still so raw, as it were?
Yeah, it was very raw. It wasn't until the 4th day that they had evidence that it was a bomb. But I'd worked in the aircraft industry, and I know the 747s don't just fall out of the sky. And I remember saying to my wife, "There's dirty work afoot here." It was the next night, about less than 24 hours later, the doorbell rang, and it was ITN came. And in those next few days, we did a number of interviews. I remember they're sitting there, and they asked me, you know, "Hasn't this destroyed your faith? You're a Christian minister." And I remember the answer I gave. I think it must come straight out of heaven, really. I wouldn't change a word of what I said. They said, "Hasn't destroyed your faith?" And I said, "Well, this is where we prove whether what we've said we've believed and what we've taught and preached for most of our lives, this is where we prove whether it's real or whether it's just a game. And I said, sir, it's very early days, 24 hours, but so far the grace of God has been more real than we ever dared believe. You know, and then I think it was in a different interview that asked me, there are rumours it was a bomb. How do you feel about the people who put the bomb on the plane? And I said, well, as far as this family is concerned, we decided the first day that whoever did it were forgiven. And I remember him saying that's a very, very generous attitude. How can you forgive people like that? And my wife signalled that she wanted to say something, and she said, well, she said, sir, we haven't murdered anybody, but we are big sinners, having to rely on the grace and mercy of God for our forgiveness and our only hope of heaven. And Jesus said, if we don't forgive our enemies, our Heavenly Father will not forgive us. Sir, she said, we dare not fool about by not forgiving. It isn't an option. I thought, wow, what an answer. Yeah.
But I guess forgiveness had to sort of be initially a whole act of the will, didn't it? Because would that change when years later you met the people that said were carrying it out, etc.? What was it like when you began to see them face to face? Was that resolve to forgive? Did that carry through to them?
Yeah, it's a long process in some ways for most people, but the forgiveness for us was instant. And I think it's because we've spent most of our lives, my wife as well, brought up in a very godly home in Germany, ethnically cleansed, had to flee from the Russians and flee from the Poles, you know, whatever, at the age of 7. But having had our heads in the Maker's Handbook, the Bible, for most of our lives, and having caught a little bit of a glimpse of who God is and what He's like, that He has our best interests at heart, I think that helped us tremendously. And so for us, it was never a struggle to forgive. I think for most people it is. And in our own lives, for other things, when I've been hurt by people, seriously hurt, it's been a long process, and you sometimes think you're forgiven, and then you find yourself thinking bad thoughts or bad-mouthing them again and to someone, and you have to go back and revisit it. That's, I think, the normal thing. Forgiveness is a journey most of the time. But in this instance, thankfully, it was instantaneous. And even when I saw the 2 Libyans, and I attended the whole of this tie is a gift from the Scottish court in the Netherlands for attending the whole of the 10-month trial in Holland. I took an apartment there. And just seeing the 2 guys behind the bulletproof glass, yes, it was surreal, but it didn't alter that sense of forgiveness. We felt sorry for whoever did it. So we're just grateful. People find it hard to believe that we could do it. If someone had asked me just a week or two before, Doug, if someone murdered your daughter, would you be able to forgive them? I think I'd have said something like, well, I'm a Christian, I hope so, but I'm not quite sure. When it came to it, I thank God, it's the grace of God. It wasn't difficult.
I mean, there'll be a lot of people watching this program, and I was thinking this as I was preparing for the program, that have things in their lives, maybe not as bad, maybe worse, if there can be anything worse, that are really struggling with forgiveness, and maybe they're guilty over the fact that they can't forgive because they know they should forgive. What would you say to them today, John?
Well, I mean, if they are Christians, if they say they're Christians, there is, first of all, there's no option. Jesus said it. You didn't say it. I didn't say it. The Archbishop of Canterbury didn't say it. Billy Graham didn't say it. You know, Jesus said it. If we don't forgive, our Heavenly Father will not forgive us. Now, I suspect there's more in there than we can unpack in this program today. But it's there. And he backed it up by telling the story of the unforgiving servant who owed the king, you know, whatever it was, £10 million, and the king forgave him because he hadn't got the money, went back and chucked a fellow servant into prison because he owed him 25p, or I'm exaggerating it a little bit, and it got to the ears of the king, and we know what happened. It wasn't a very happy ending for the guy. Jesus told our story to back this up. And even in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive them that... they are linked almost as if it is a requirement for salvation. Now, I don't believe in salvation by works, but it's there. And I think be patient, be persistent. If you have to keep revisiting it, revisit it. The person that I had to forgive, eventually I got them round for lunch and, talked things through. And I tell you what I found as well is that if I start praying for someone who's hurt me, somehow I start to love them again. And it makes a big difference. Yeah.
I mean, and things haven't been always that easy for you after that. I mean, that in itself was a terrible thing to live through. But I think years later, it really took its toll upon you, didn't it?
It was for 8 years. I was fine. I was preaching. I was, doing fine, and then suddenly I cracked. There were certain things happening in the church I was pastoring, and in the movement I was part of, and I just couldn't handle it, and I cracked big time, really, and I had to leave my church, and for a while I was still preaching up and down the country, and that was fine. Wherever I had some good friends who would invite me to their churches to preach, and that was okay, but I couldn't face decisions or difficult situations for about 18 months or so, and then I gradually got back into it and became part of a team in a church again.
How difficult was that for you? I mean, after coming through everything up until then, again, I think to really help people, if you expect, did you feel guilty that you were like this? Did you feel you were letting God down or people down? How did you feel in those 18 months?
I didn't feel as if I was letting God down, but I did feel guilty. I mean, and this is a well-known and well-documented phenomenon that people, professional people, especially in the caring services, doctors, nurses, ministers, and people like that, when they crash, they feel guilty. It shouldn't be happening to me. I'm a person who looks after other people. I'm a strengthener to others. And certainly I felt like that. For a year and a half, it was difficult. It was embarrassing, And thankfully my wife was very patient with me. She was a tower of strength.
Great. Coming up to date, I mean, recent events in Libya, Gaddafi, now no longer with us. How do you see those events? Do you see that as somehow drawing a line, drawing an ending to all of this, or are there still things out there that you need to look into?
Yeah. I don't think anything draws a line under it. The most precious thing a person can possess, their child, has been taken from us brutally and brutally murdered. I happen, as you know from our conversations, I happen not to believe that the Libyans did it. Gaddafi may have helped finance it, I don't know, but certainly the man who went home to die to Libya, Mr. Megrahi, I came away from the trial feeling he's not guilty. But nothing. There's no such thing as closure. The most precious thing has been taken from us. It's a bit like, it's not an illness that you recover from. It's more like an amputation that we learn to live with, and we'll walk with a limp for the rest of our days. But maybe by the grace of God, we might just be better people for it. But nothing brings closure. It's interesting what is happening in Libya, and certainly not a good guy as Mr. Gaddafi. But I trust that they will have better days in that country in the future.
And of course, you were invited to Libya, weren't you?
Twice.
In the years, twice, yes.
Been twice. We had a project there. We wanted to build a bridge, even though I didn't believe the Libyans had done it. Their leader had been guilty of atrocities around the world and providing Semtex to every bunch of ne'er-do-wells on the planet, virtually. And so we were very happy to take the compensation money. And I just might be wrong. Maybe the Libyans did do it. I'm 95% convinced not so. But yes, we went as guests of the Gaddafi Foundation, and we looked at children's homes and that, and eventually decided to buy an ambulance for them for a multi-handicapped children's home. They're all mentally handicapped and physically handicapped, like thalidomide kids, but with bent minds. And I must say they were extremely well cared for, extremely well cared for. And we Land Rover built us a lovely long wheelbase ambulance, and the Libyans told them what kit they wanted in it, and it was vastly over kitted out, and I'm sure it's been well used during this war.
And of course, this is something that you have to. Has this helped you with setting up the memorial to Helga, and to be able to reach out to like this to children in need? Has that been able to help you in the years since, months since?
Tremendously. At the memorial service in Birmingham for our daughter, which was a week or so after Christmas, someone put a large plastic dustbin at the door and said, John and Lisa are interested in helping a children's home in Asia, or building a children's home in Asia, and people put the money in there. I've forgotten what was in there now, £6,000 I think. And then local businesses and schools and churches started sending us money. I was invited to go to the States, and churches I went to gave money. We had got some missionaries who'd just gone to the Philippines, and they were having abandoned and abused children brought to them, kids just left in the bush to die, at the mercy of wild animals or whatever. And they said, look, we've got to do something about this. So we built a children's home there. It's called the Helga Mosey Children's Home. They chose the name, not us. And since then, in the 22 years it's been going, there's been 112 kids through that home. The authorities in the Philippines say that more than 50% of those kids would be dead today if our daughter was alive. You know, I mean, a horrendous story of little girls raped on an almost weekly basis from very young age, and then eventually brought to us. Boys treated very badly. One little girl at the age of 4 dumped in the city, and fended for herself for a year before someone brought her to our home. And then we have another place in India for destitute girls, and we're involved in projects in Pakistan and I think 12 countries around the world at the moment. Yes, it gives us a lot of joy. We haven't got Helga. We're going to see her again one day, but in the meantime we've got lots of sons and daughters.
Maybe we've got a few minutes left in the programme. Maybe we can come back to the personal side. These homes and obviously this memorial to Helga really helps. In your home, in your family, how do you keep her alive? How do you treat the fact that another year has gone where you would have had your daughter and you don't now? How do you deal with that as a family on an ongoing basis?
Well, I guess in a way, I suppose, 24 years coming up, you sort of get used to it. I think there aren't many days that Helga doesn't figure in my thinking somewhere. I think in the first 10 years, there was hardly an hour when she didn't figure in my thinking in some way, or something to do with her. But you get used to it. You learn to live without people. I mean, people watching this program have lost spouses, parents. We all have to bury our parents at some time in our lives, and it's not nice. So you become accustomed to it. But having our children's homes, having our projects, and of course the whole Lockerbie political thing, which is a whole another story, still being very much alive and controversial, keeps it's there in front of our eyes all the time. It's a part of our lives. It's it's the pivot of our lives. We haven't let it take over. We've got a bigger agenda, and that is the kingdom of heaven. But we said to God, I think it was the next night, standing in the hallway of our house in Oldbury, near Birmingham, Lord, if you will help us, we will get as much mileage for the kingdom of heaven out of this as we can. Mm-hmm. And God has helped us. And so that is our mission, really. I mean, can I take you back just for a moment to the fifth morning? On the fourth day, the evidence was found that it was almost certainly a bomb. Screams of anger, especially from the United States, from some of the American relatives, nuke the Arabs. You know, they wanted the Middle East wiping off the planet. And I sat at her desk very early that morning, and I said, in her room in the attic of our house, and I said, Lord, I don't want to be like that. If I want an eye for an eye, and I thought of the words of Gandhi, an eye for an eye and the world will soon be blind. If I want an eye for an eye, someone dead because my kid's dead, I reduce myself to the level of the terrorists. I make myself no better than they are. But I've got to do something. Yeah. And that verse came to me, Romans 12:21. Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil by doing good. And that has been our daily quest. I guess that's why I'm here today.
Yeah. John, bless you. Thank you for sharing your heart with us today. It's been great. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for watching. May the Lord bless you and take this message to heart. See you again soon. Goodbye.